All right, everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed that first session. Stay tuned for more fantastic content coming your way. Up next, we have a webinar presented by TeleSign, focused on the role of digital identity in establishing trust in a decentralized world. We have a fantastic roster of speakers for you. Lovlesh Chhabra, Vice President, Identity, Privacy, and Mobile Platforms with Verizon Media. Stacy Stubblefield, Co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer at TeleSign. And my friend and colleague, Simeon Beal, a director here at One World Identity. Take it away, Simeon.
Thanks, Cameron. And once again, thank you for all the webinar attendees today who joined. We're really pleased with the turnout, and thank you for joining us in this new format for ours. And thank you for attending the webinar. So today's webinar, as Cameron stated, is the role of digital identity in establishing trust in a decentralized world. So now more than ever, with COVID-19 really being on top of mind, it's really forced most people and disrupted most people's lives, both professionally and personally. Now, this really introduces new concerns about how digital platforms can try to establish trust with their consumers. And today we're going to talk about the role in digital identity and helping platforms do just that. And after we talk about some of the problems, Stacy and Lovlesh will, some of the smartest people I know, will talk about some of the solutions that can help drive operating efficiencies and help regain some of the trust that might have temporarily been shaken with the events over the past few months. So the main problem we're seeing is, again, there's this very apparent change in behavior, both from the consumer side and from the fraudster side. Consumers are changing the way they engage with digital platforms. They're changing the locations they engage, the frequency by which they engage, and fraudsters really isolate this as an opportunity to capitalize on what I like to call digital chaos. As people are still trying to understand where the chips fall, fraudsters see an opportunity to really gauge in and take a hold of people's uncertainty. Now, the area we're really seeing most of this disruption is in the general public, e-commerce, and the workforce. Unfortunately, and fortunately, COVID-19 is an interesting attack vector for fraudsters because it's very much industry agnostic. Typically, when we see fraudsters engage in what we call phishing scams or malware attacks, they're very much keyed in on search terms that are very particular to a persona. But in this case, unfortunately, COVID-19 has affected everyone and everything in some way, shape, or fashion. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of phishing attacks across the board. I'm just trying to advance my slide here. There we go. And unfortunately, they're successful. So even now, even so much so that we're seeing the federal government and national agencies coming out and trying to issue warnings for people to be more hesitant and cautious when transacting online. The first one of these that I noticed was on March 10th. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency issued a warning of social engineering and phishing scams rampantly entering in the digital domain. 10 days later, unfortunately, the US Attorney also had to issue an additional statement warning of increased phishing emails, malicious websites and apps, and fake charities asking for money. And later in the same day, the FBI released a statement warning of something similar, but different here, the counterfeit treatments or equipment. Now on the right, we're also seeing something commensurate with this trend about how many new COVID-19 domain registrations were made. We see a small tick, but an uptick in mid-February that gradually declined throughout the month. But then in March, we're seeing this tremendous spike across the board, and both good and bad actors, I will caveat saying both good and bad actors are making domain registrations here, but we can start to understand that more and more domains are popping up with this nature, indicating that there's just more noise, more chances for opportunities for fraudsters to insert themselves and take advantage. Now, this is one of my favorite examples. Hopefully it has died since it came out in mid-February. But on the left-hand side, this is the popular dashboard made by Johns Hopkins University, tracking the initial outbreak of the virus and its subsequent development. Made public, it's free for anyone who has access. On the right-hand side, though, we see the very infamous now cyber criminal forum named XSS out of Russia that has developed a scam or a potential phishing scam that is saying this is a custom build built out of data obtained by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they will build it for you for $200 if you so choose to. And you can't hate the fraudsters. They even go above and beyond and say that if you require a Java code sign certificate, they would charge you $700. So give it to them. They even know how to upsell and an opportunity to make more money. But this is just, again, an example of something that everyone is very interested in the developments. The dashboard looks very attractive, looks dynamic. So it's an opportunity to sell to people who are not familiar with it being in a publicly available resource. And this, where the most nefarious part of this whole design really comes from, is this allows the fraudsters a door to open to establish a very secure and trusted relationship with a good credited user and gain access to their credentials. And then they use these credentials for much more lucrative use cases, most notably e-commerce and now the workforce, because again, these two areas are where we're seeing the most disruption. And when we're talking about cyber criminal activity, it's very important to remind ourselves about how consumer behaviors have changed and for us to react to that as well. So this is the type of data points and data elements fraudsters are looking at. So let's key in on, let's take e-commerce first, and let's understand on how some of those consumer behaviors have really changed. So here we have a few graphs. On the top left, we have a survey issued to 2,000 digital users, asking them how have their consuming behaviors changed online since the COVID-19 outbreak. Most notably, 40% of people thankfully haven't changed too much. That's on the right here, but nothing about their shopping behaviors have changed, but we're seeing big upticks across the board on checking out marketing messages, browsing for things to buy online, and making online purchases. Now, when we talk about checking out marketing messages, this is very much an indication that people are browsing. People are looking for things, but not necessarily making transactions. So this is another indication, a data point for us that it's a busy digital marketplace. It's a very busy digital atmosphere. And if we look a little bit more granular, we look over here at France's, on the graph on the right. France did a study on March 13th about trends post-COVID-19 on how people are interacting online. Now, I think this graph is really interesting because it offers us 4 different types of retail areas: hotel websites, online groceries, fashion retail, and online pharmacies. Now, 2 of these, hotel websites and fashion retail, we mostly consider to be elastic goods, right? Things that are flexible, people buy with their disposable income. But online groceries and online pharmacies are the inelastic goods, all that we expect to see these giant upticks in. However, now hotel websites notably are down both in traffic and transaction numbers, but that is pretty understandable given that we're just not traveling as much. Stay-at-home orders have been issued across the world. But if we're thinking about fashion retail, the traffic numbers are up 6.1%. Now, people aren't buying those, obviously indicated by the 9.9% decrease in transactions, but this is speaking to people have more time on their hands and they're just using the web to browse and window shop, as I like to indicate. Even in online pharmacies, we're seeing a 15.3% increase in traffic alone. Now, the transaction numbers being as low as they could probably most likely indicate that inventories are down, numbers are down. People are just interested in learning. So they're undiscovered, undefined number of characteristics that go into that delta. But ultimately, big takeaway for me is that the traffic numbers are spiked across the board. And we're really seeing this commensurate with the spending trends. Across e-commerce platforms, the amount of ad spend spiked to 9.6 million during the week of March 7th, which is up from nearly half of that, 4.8 million on February 17th. And we're seeing that in the sales too. On March 24th, there was a 23% increase in global e-commerce sales compared to the weekly average so far for 2020. So just a tremendous amount of more dollars spent or entering the marketplace, creating even more opportunity. And I hate to say, it's kind of working. And unfortunately, we're seeing people, and as expected, we're seeing some results. Fraudsters are seeing some good, I'm sorry, I'm gasping, and just them actually capitalizing on such an unfortunate series of events. But in the UK, we've already noted, and this statistic is from late in March, over 21 cases of COVID-19 related fraud schemes, resulting in over 800,000 pounds of losses, nearly $1 million US. TransUnion issued a survey where they noted 22% of respondents had been targets of digital fraud related to COVID-19. And ultimately, it's just creating this tremendous amount of noise. Again, the theme of this being the volume at which traffic is spiking is creating an easy attack vector for fraudsters to exploit, because it becomes tremendously more difficult for good actors, for digital identity experts, for security professionals to identify good users and the bad users, because a lot of the models we've been using in the past are just inundated with a tremendous amount of noise. And another area where we're seeing a lot of this disruption and change in consumer trends is in the workforce. So in the workforce, for many of us, we're working from home, we're tuning in this webinar from home, and as such, it's introduced a bevy of new challenges. The top 3, I will segment off from the bottom 3 and talk about them almost holistically. So if we think about this concept of bring your own device, BYOD, this concept or term is probably familiar for most of us, But for a lot of professionals out there who are very used to going into physical locations on-prem and using company issued devices that now have to work from a remote workforce, they're now having to adapt and be flexible in what type of devices they're using to complete their work. Now, companies want to enable this because by no means do they want to marginalize or slow down their operating efficiencies, but allowing users to use different devices introduces a tremendous amount of variability. Now, we're identifying variability in device types, operating systems, permission settings, personal app activity that can even, again, add more noise to the network. But this also makes it tremendously hard to ensure endpoint security and authentication standards. So we think about endpoint security again. If I'm a security professional and I'm monitoring all the different activity that's happening in my network before this outbreak happened, I have a very defined set of patterns and expectations that I'd like to see, and the number of nodes that are pinging my network are probably pretty understanding and expected. But now again, if we're thinking about people using personal devices, iPads, their own personal phones, different laptops, their spouses or partners' laptops, we can see a 4 to 5x increase in the number of connections. Creating, again, this noise is just, it's incredible. Now, again, now we're talking about device variability, ensuring the same level of security standards and authentication standards for each of these devices becomes tremendously challenging as well. So we're thinking about this being a unique set of variabilities and vulnerabilities that people are trying to grapple with. Now, the 3 more at the bottom here, which equally as important, just IT resources. So ID departments are very challenged to answer the number of inbound inquiries that employees are sending them, right? So, and there's a large range of low risk to high risk issues that they're inundated with, and they're trying to respond the best they can. But it's troublesome to identify, again, the high risk areas from the good risk and want to treat everyone with the same level of courtesy and understanding. But this also makes them susceptible to social engineering attacks to slip through the cracks when they're just how this inbound are trying to handle. Now, public Wi-Fi is another very popular and common attack vector. Thankfully, it's not as much of an issue as we've seen in the past because of all these stay-at-home orders and people are really quarantining themselves off, but people are still going out to parks to take phone calls. People are still trying to shop and they're taking work calls or trying to connect to public Wi-Fi. I know even myself, I was at a Trader Joe's last month and I was tempted to connect to Brooklyn Wi-Fi to make sure I got a ping from someone at work I was expecting. And I had to prevent myself. Oh, no, don't do that. And I was just took the moment to tell someone around me as well, because they were asking for the Wi-Fi password. It was a great digital identity moment I'm proud of, but we'll digress there. But again, this is an area that's very easily exploited by fraudsters. And last but not least, the required third-party technology. So for most of us, this change really happened very quickly. And companies were forced to bring on third-party softwares quicker than probably they wanted to, and had not done the necessary due diligence that they would have liked in normal environments. So they weren't necessarily assured with the impact that it could have on their own software. Especially again, these flexible work environments that your employees will ask you for different ways to engage and to talk and communicate and to work. And most of the time people are pretty flexible and they want to be accommodating. So this introduces a tremendous amount, again, of variability and uncertainty. Now, I will pause there because I feel like I just talked through 3 slides of doom and gloom, but thankfully we have Stacy and Lovlesh coming up who've been tirelessly working to solve some of these problems for some time and are really focused on how digital identity can come into your product stack and help prevent some of these issues. So without further ado, Stacy, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Simeon. That was an excellent overview of all of the types of things that we're seeing now with COVID-19. And so I'll just sort of pick it up there and give a little bit of an overview of what it looks like on the fraud prevention side. So what we're really seeing are the same types of attacks that have always been around. These attacks are not new. They're not things that companies have never seen before. It's not a new type of technology. It's the same old thing, right? It's just being focused on the specific vulnerabilities that have evolved due to COVID-19. And so what does that mean? That as Simeon was speaking to, a lot of companies had to go remote very, very quickly. And so that means they weren't able necessarily to do the training with the end users that they would normally do when they're using some new type of technology. So for instance, a lot of companies have moved all of their conferencing onto Zoom, which makes sense. It's easy to use and it's, it's quick, but I'm sure many of you guys have seen the reports with Zoom bombing, people actually coming on to Zoom meetings that aren't supposed to be there. They do it in various different ways. They find publicly posted links, or they just try different combinations of codes so that they can enter into the meeting. It's hard to blame people who have just set up Zoom. They don't know all of the different ways to stop these types of attacks. And you just see that across the board. Zoom is just one example, of course, but there's a bunch of other technologies that are being used and have been deployed very, very quickly by people who weren't expecting to need to deploy them and didn't have time to make sure that they trained everyone properly. So what that really comes down to is that the attack surface is much bigger than it was before in these technologies. So whereas before you had maybe a handful of people who are working from home at different companies, you now have everyone that's working from home. So instead of just attacking those few people that were working from home, you can attack everyone. Everyone is a potential target. And so that's really what we're seeing. And we're also seeing attacks that are very, very focused, obviously, on COVID-19 and taking advantage of the fear and the uncertainty that all of these people are seeing. And really, the new exploit is not so much a technological exploit, it's a human exploit. It's getting into people's minds and understanding what's driving them is fear and uncertainty about what's happening. And so you'll see email subject lines that are something like, your new benefits for COVID-19, or anything that is going to entice people to open it based on the fact that they want more information about this new scenario that they're not accustomed to. So really, that's what we're seeing on the COVID-19 side, and that's how it's affecting attacks. See if we can go to the next slide. Okay. And so what does this mean? Really, why are the fraudsters performing these attacks? Well, they're doing it for the same reason that they always do, and that is to gain access to user accounts and network resources that they normally wouldn't have access to, or they obviously shouldn't have access to. And so the question that you as a company really need to be able to answer is, are the users who are accessing your website, your app, or your corporate network who they claim to be? And of course, this is extremely difficult in a remote workforce scenario. And so let's talk about mobile identity. Mobile identity is one way that we can solve some of these problems in understanding who it is that is accessing different resources. And so what is mobile identity really? Well, we can sum it up by saying it's just all about using a mobile device to identify a user. So of course, there are many different ways to identify users. Mobile identity is just about using the mobile device to identify the user. And so there are a few different ways that we can break that down. One is two-factor authentication. So just using a one-time passcode to identify your user and make sure it's the right person logging in. You also have phone number attributes, and I'll get into each of these in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. And then we also have contact information. So that's really what is the name and address of the person behind this phone number. And so I'll go through each one in a little bit more detail. So two-factor authentication, I'm sure, when we started this company, TeleSign, back in 2005, no one knew what two-factor authentication was. Now I don't really have to spend so much time explaining what it is anymore. I'm sure most of the people on this call have received a one-time passcode via SMS or call at some point in the past when they were trying to access an account That's what two-factor authentication is. And it's always important, right? It's always important to have something beyond just your username and password that is protecting an account. But now that you have so many people remote, especially in the workforce, now that you have so many people remotely accessing very sensitive data, it's even more important than ever to make sure that there's something beyond just a username and password that is protecting these very important accounts. And it's not just your network account. I mean, it might be, obviously accessing the network is extremely sensitive, and you want to make sure that you have two-factor authentication turned on, on your VPN or whatever way that you're using to access the network. But there are other things that are just as important. You think about Slack, for instance. If somebody was able to access somebody else's Slack account, think about the things that they could get other people to tell them in the company, or other people to do in the company, because it's a channel that most people feel is very secure, and they're not on the lookout for somebody impersonating someone else on Slack or a similar type of communication account. So it could be very easy to exploit people using that channel. So just making sure that every sensitive channel, every sensitive piece of information is locked down by 2FA is extremely important. Password reset, this is just another variation basically on the two-factor authentication flow, where if somebody loses their password, they need to be able, obviously, to reset their password easily. And so one way to do that is to get them to enter in their username and their phone number that is already pre-registered to that username, send a one-time passcode to the phone number, and then have the user enter in that passcode so that they can reset their password. Now, this is obviously always helpful. It's helpful, whether everyone is remote or not. But during these days when there are so many people working remote, your help desk is probably already overwhelmed with people asking, for help with various different things, for setting up this or that, for accessing this or that. I'm sure your help desk teams are very busy these days. And so anything that you can automate to take some of the work off of them is extremely important. And so this is one way to automate one of the most common help desk requests, which is resetting a password. And the same thing can be done, obviously, for your end users. It doesn't just need to be people who are employees of your work. Phone number attributes. This is, it can mean a bunch of different things, or it can actually be a bunch of different things, but basically what it comes down to is information about a phone number that somebody is entering in to do either a registration or a two-factor authentication. And in this scenario, the two most important pieces of information, or the two most important phone number attributes, are really the date that the SIM card was last changed, and then the date that the phone number was first activated. And I'll go through each one and the scenarios when they're helpful. And so first, we'll start with your current users, be they employees or users of your website or app. SIM swap is obviously, or the date that the SIM was last swapped is important to know, because in sophisticated attacks, what happens is a fraudster will target a particular user. They decide that they want access to that user's account. They find out the user's phone number, and then they socially engineer the user's phone company to actually switch the user's phone number onto a SIM card that's controlled by the attacker. And so they've effectively taken over the the victim's phone number at that point, and they can then use that phone number to access different accounts. This is obviously a very involved attack. It's not something that's going to be done on a mass scale, but it can be done if the fraudster identifies a high value target. And we have obviously heard of this attack happening. So the best way to prevent this type of attack is to check when the SIM card was actually last changed. That information comes directly from the telecom carrier. And so you can check that and see, was the SIM card changed in the past 24 hours or was it last changed, many months or years ago? If it was many months or years ago, no problem. The SIM card is still attached to the same device that's been attached to you for a long time. You're good to go. If it was changed in the past 24 to 48 hours, that's a huge red flag. And it means that there is a definite possibility that somebody has taken over this user's phone number and is trying to perform some type of attack. We wouldn't recommend using this in every single scenario, but in any type of high value scenario where there's a large amount of money being transacted or somebody's trying to access some very sensitive information, this is definitely something to check. And another thing to be aware of is once you see that the SIM card has recently been changed, that phone is no longer a good way to verify the user, be it via one-time passcode or via call. So making a call to the user to verify them at that point also doesn't make sense. You need to find another channel to access the user by to make sure that it's the correct person. So let's go to the next one, phone number attributes for the new user. So in this case, the attribute that you would want to check would be when the phone number was actually activated. And the reason for doing this is because fraudsters are out there now, and they're, as usual, frankly, they're trying to create, thousands or tens of thousands of new accounts. And why do they do that? They do that because they need these, email accounts or social media accounts that they can use to email out their phishing schemes, email out their malicious attachments, post, incorrect information, all of the things that fraudsters do. So they're trying to create all of these accounts. And in many cases, this requires a phone number to create the account. So what do fraudsters do? They go and get a bunch of brand new SIM cards and create essentially create new phone numbers that they attach to those SIM cards, create new, basically phone accounts. And so one way to stop this is checking, when was this account actually created at the carrier? Was it created yesterday or was it created 10 years ago? Of course, it was created 10 years ago. It's a much lower risk phone number. It's probably just a good user trying to create a new account. You can speed them through the process, easy peasy. However, if it was created yesterday, there's a decent chance that this is an attacker just trying to create bulk accounts. And especially if you use this in conjunction with other pieces of information like the IP address, device ID, activity, path, those types of things. You can use that in conjunction to really be able to pinpoint when somebody is trying to create accounts in bulk. And then last but not least, name and address. Why is it important? Well, what is it? Basically, it's the name and address associated with the phone number, and that information is coming back from the carrier itself. And so why is this important? Well, especially in financial services, in a normal world, to create a new account, you could just walk into a bank and show your ID. In today's world, most people, either don't want to go into their bank or their bank isn't available. And not just banks, but other types of services as well, where it's important to know exactly who the person is. So because it's very difficult to actually do a face-to-face transaction, but the services that need to know exactly who a person is still, need to continue operating, we need another way to verify the identity behind the phone number. And so one way to do that is to actually pull the name and address information directly from the carrier and match it to the information provided by the user. And so if the information matches and the user can actually receive a one-time passcode at that phone number that they've given you, you've really created a strong tie to that digital identity to make sure that the person that has come onto your website or onto your app is the person who they claim to be. And so with that, I am going to bring in Lovlesh Chhabra, who is the Vice President of Identity, Privacy, and Mobile Platforms at Verizon Media, so that we can chat and ask and answer a few questions related to what Verizon Media is seeing. Hi, Lovlesh. How are you?
Hey, doing well, Stacy. How are you?
I'm good. And so can you give us a brief background of your history and what you're currently responsible for over at Verizon Media?
Sure. I'll start with my current responsibilities. I work with Verizon Media as the VP of Product and Engineering for our identity, privacy, and mobile platforms teams. And this is the team that's responsible largely for consumer accounts across all of our brands, which is Yahoo, AOL, TechCrunch, Huffington Post. It's a long list, right? And we, as you said, we've been seeing some of these trends and changes that Simeon and you covered. Prior to this, I worked at Oracle, IBM, Pfizer, as well as GE Consumer Finance.
Awesome. So you have quite a bit of experience in this area, it sounds like.
Mhm.
All right. So can you give us just a little bit of overview of how Verizon Media has changed in the past few weeks? Are most employees working from home at this point? And is that normal? What are you guys seeing?
Well, it's definitely not normal. Prior to, say about three and a half weeks ago, nearly all of our workforce was in a physical location. We would all drive to work or shuttles to work and, work from our offices. We do have laptops, so people did check in from home from time to time or on a production issue and things like that. But now, greater than 99%, almost all of our employees are work from home unless there is a specific need for them to go in. As in, if you're working at a data center and there is an issue with the site, so you need to go in, for a couple of hours and come back. And even in those cases, there are specific detailed, procedures around hygiene and, what you touch and what you don't, and gloves and masks, and all of that processes have to be put in place. But you're right, about 3 weeks ago, we had to shift essentially overnight the entire workforce to start working from home.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. It sounds like it's been a big change for your company, and I think that that's very common across companies. So you guys are experiencing very similar things to what I'm sure a bunch of people in the audience are experiencing right now. And then on the user side, on your end user side, are you guys seeing a change there? Are there more registrations than usual, more traffic than usual, or what have you seen?
So this is a heavy news cycle kind of an environment, right? And like I said earlier, we own a bunch of news properties. So there is a very high sort of change in pattern as, overall traffic as well as time of day traffic. Users are looking for, trustworthy, verified information online, and they go to news outlets that they trust. Huffington Post, as an example, is one. Yahoo News is another one. We have a coronavirus hub that the team stood up in a matter of days, as soon as the pandemic was realized and the impact was visible. So yes, definitely, we've seen an increase in traffic pattern, as well as an increase in our signed-in usage, where users are checking their emails more often.
Mhm.
Services that require signed-in are email and fantasy games and things like that. And there is an increased interest in making sure the users are staying on top of stuff that's coming into their mailbox or that is being published by trustworthy news outlets.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally. So how are you guys keeping your employee accounts secure specifically right now? Have you made any major changes to what you're using or how you're educating them, anything like that?
So we've been, I think, some of our work the past couple of years has actually come to roost now. Past couple of years, we've been working on essentially strictly enforcing principles of least privilege. So just by being an employee, you don't have access to all the systems. You have access to systems that you need to have access to. And there is periodic review of the privileges granted, right? So that has helped. And we've been working on rolling out True MFA the last 4 to 5 years. So that also starts to play a role. Like you covered the value of 2FA. For employee accounts, there's multi-factor auth. So there are systems that are just behind the two-factor, but then there are systems that are more sensitive where you have to do your password, your second factor, as well as your FIDO. So, we layer up. And that would be my advice to, companies that had to jump quick is to
look at what beyond two-factor, right? If one of the two is compromised, the other one sort of becomes easy to trick or get into a man-in-the-middle attack and things like that. But the harder you make, especially with hardware keys and things like that, then it's really hard to trick the user to give you that hardware key, or you have to be in close proximity to be able to do that, which right now nobody is in anybody's close proximity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then for your end user accounts, is there anything that you guys have changed there? Are you monitoring them more closely? Have you added any, new tech there? What do you do?
Yeah, so on the end user side, we've been building up on an identity model the last couple of years that relies heavily on greater than one ways of reaching out to our users, right? Like you said, SMS is a good, healthy way to reach users, and it's ubiquitous. There is no need to download a new app or learn a new way of doing things. Almost everybody that has a cell phone knows how to use SMS. But that's not enough, because if that channel goes down or into the hands of a bad actor, we need an alternate means to reach our users, right? So we've been running campaigns for the last couple of years to get users to share with us either greater than one mobile numbers or greater than one channels, which could include email, or in some examples, even their social handles as a way of us to reach out to them, right? So you put all this together, as well as we've made significant investments in learning normal user behavior, right? So everybody talks about machine learning and big data and what kind of hints you can gather. So if you just look deeper in your systems, you'll find ways to understand what your users normally do and what they normally don't do. And that helps you separate good from the bad, because bad actors, if they have to invest the amount of time it takes to emulate behavior, that becomes more expensive for them to break into, say, Stacy's account, because they have to know Stacy's usage patterns, right? Most of the attacks you're seeing today, and you've seen in the last so many years, are not as well targeted. They are more mass attacks, and they tend to find the audience that's high vulnerability or low in technical knowledge to understand that a URL misspelled by a letter is actually a different website, not the website that you intended to go to, right?
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And then you have a ton of experience in the space. As we could tell when you went over your background, what is some of the biggest challenge, or what is the biggest challenge you've seen so far in digital identity? And then how have you guys solved it, or how have you solved it, or has it not been solved? Go for it.
Yeah, so I think digital identity is, if you dial back in time, Stacy, I think it all started as security was the user's job. Every website put out their own set of password rules and said, as long as you create a password that follows my rule set, that's amazing, life is good, right? And we sort of put it on the user to choose a unique password and a good password. And that's how we would identify with a combination of your username, which in many cases is public information. It's tied to your email address and things like that. And then the only private key held was this, this password that you were asked to memorize, but also keep it unique, right? Each of us on this call probably has north of 200 passwords, right? And that is a hard problem for each user to solve. I think the way we are looking at from a digital identity perspective is that this should not be the user's problem. This is our problem. We need the user to authenticate so they can use services we provide, not sort of the other way around, right? And the last couple of years, we've been working hard to solve it in ways that it makes sense to users. And you have to look at your users in cohorts. Not one answer will fit all. For example, if you go back about 3 years, a password length of 16 was considered good enough, right? But now we're allowing passwords that are almost as long as 100 characters, right? You could write a whole song in there if you wanted, right? Your own song. But what that does is it allows the tech-heavy population to go create a password and use it as a single factor if that's what they choose for convenience. But that's a password that's almost uncrackable, right? Second layer is users that just want convenience, but still need security, right? We've launched product like Account Key, where you could use your mobile app as your authenticator. You say yes or no to every sign-in. You get to monitor if somebody is attempting to get into your account. and there are no codes to remember, no passwords to remember, right? That's another cohort, and that's a very healthy cohort for us. Another one is, like I said, our investments in machine learning, and that's, I think, something that everybody should find ways to do. It's not always, there are plenty of commercial off-the-shelf products that actually meet the needs. In our case, it's our own homegrown solutions that we use. But the idea is we need to invest in understanding our users beyond the combination of username and password and serve them where they are versus bringing them to sort of the archaic models of, if you choose a good password, you're safe. If not, too bad, it's your fault, right? And we have partnered with TeleSign for a bunch of the signals that you talked about to help protect our users, and that sort of plays into our security models. But that's not the focus of the talk, so I'll leave that aside.
That makes sense. And then finally, if you could give the listeners just one piece of advice when it has to do with digital identity, what would your piece of advice be?
I think it may sound a little broad brushed, but I think my piece of advice will be, we have to do security by design, right? When we look at user experience, when we look at security, they almost seem to be competing with each other. You can have great security or you can have great user experience, but not both. I think what we have to do is to change that dialogue and say, we have to do security by design. Great user experience and great security both have to come together.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. And it's something that, like you said, we've seen it as a vendor, competing at every single company. You have people on the one hand trying to make everything as smooth as possible, as easy as possible. On the other hand, you have the security folks saying, no, like, we have to make sure the fraudsters stay out. So it's definitely a very common theme and a very big challenge. And we're definitely seeing a huge change so that people are very focused on making sure when they build things, they're secure from the start. So thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Great. And so I think we are going to go to audience Q&A now.
Yes, exactly, Stacy. And thank you, Lovlesh, for that perspective, and Stacy for yours as well. I know it was tremendous from my end. But we have some great questions from the audience. So if you guys are game, we have a few minutes here. I'd love to throw some your way. The first is from an anonymous attendee. The question is around considering the relationship between enrollment and authentication. So the question is how you enroll the customer a risk factor you should consider when you authenticate them in the future?
Stacy, I can take that on if you're okay. Yeah, and I think that's 100% true. At the time of enrollment and at the time of authentication, there is a strong relationship with those, and there are signals you can pick up at enrollment that, if you marry them with the signals at authentication, can tell you a fraudster from a good user. And there is an example that recently was out in the media. One of the companies in Silicon Valley, a known social network, said they are disabling 1 million accounts every day in their fight against fake accounts and fake news. I am hard pressed to believe that they didn't use signals from registration, right? You have to start your data gathering for security at your first interaction point, which is the enrollment/registration. And then you tie that to the behaviors that you see on your network tied to either authentication or activity on the network. And that's how you bring a profile together and say, oh, this is not a good actor. They don't have what it takes to be a good actor.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Sean McMahon. What is the best way to use identity to help prevent customers to falling for phishing attacks with so much of these transactions and activity being outside the enterprise's control?
I mean, I'll take that, and then Lovlesh, if you want to add on, go for it. So phishing attacks are only as effective as the data that's gathered during the phishing attack, right? So most phishing attacks, the fraudster is looking for credentials, username and passwords that you can log into an account somewhere, right? And so if that account is protected via some other form of security, be it two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, background, checks on IP address, device ID, that type of thing, then that phishing attack, even though the fraudster may have gained access to that user's credentials, is still not going to be effective because the fraudster won't be able to access the user's account. Lovlesh, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered that.
Yeah, Stacy, seconding Lovlesh was a great response. We have here another question from Mark Harvey. So when we talk about digital identity and some of the mobile identity topics we've touched upon today, it's hard for us not to bring in the mobile operators. So when we think about this time, especially with all the volume going on, why do you think the mobile operators are being so slow in releasing their data to protect users? As Mark puts it, there seems to be a great new revenue stream for them.
Yeah, so I can definitely take that. I think there's a bunch of different reasons. On the one hand, look, like we would love if they released all of their information tomorrow, but because we have so many different use cases for it. But on the other hand, these are highly regulated companies. They're very, very privacy centric. They're kind of like the exact opposite of Silicon Valley. They're very focused on making sure that their customers retain, trust in them not to share their data. So they're very careful about what use cases they share it for typically. So that's one thing. Another thing is just purely, on the technical side, they need to build out the APIs so that companies can have access to this data. On the business side, they need to be able to bill for it, of course. So all of that takes time to build out. And then finally, just on the education side, I remember when we first started doing this, we would walk into a room to educate carriers about how their data could be used. And when I would give these presentations, I was thinking like, hey, these guys in the audience, they already know exactly what I'm talking about. And, I'm just wasting time giving a presentation. But it turns out that in most cases, they didn't understand the use cases at all. They didn't understand the types of fraud that were happening on the web, and they didn't understand how their data could be used to stop it. And so a lot of this has just been an education process, getting them to understand how and why their data can be useful.
So if I may add that add there a little bit, Simeon, if that's okay. I do work for Verizon, right? So I have a little bit of an inside view there. And I think Stacy's first point is actually a very large thought cycle that we have to go through. When Verizon decides to open up a data set, first part of this is our responsibility to our users, the trust that we have in them and then they have in us, right? This is a two-way street. And so for that trust and responsibility, we have to make sure that before we open the data set, we're opening it for the right purposes, and we have the user's consent to share the data for that purpose, right? I mean, Verizon was privacy conscious before privacy was cool, right? Now everybody's privacy conscious. So just keep that in mind, in addition to Stacy's point.
No, very much appreciated. It's definitely going to take a long and process. And to your point, I think we don't want to get gun shy, right? We are not gun heavy. We don't want to react quickly to this problem and then open up a whole new can of worms. And then all of a sudden we have a new set of problems and challenges in front of us. So I think we have time for one more question before I turn it back to Cam for some final thoughts. But last question here is from Kirill Gondol. How really e-commerce and financial organizations are worrying about identity-related frauds, and to what extent are they ready to invest in new technologies of fraud prevention? So from Lovlesh, from your perspective, and Stacy from yours, what do you think the appetite is over the last month or two to opening up to new solutions around this fraud and risk prevention space, and what are some of the areas you're seeing most traction?
Lovlesh, you can go for that, or either way.
Sure. So we have a fairly large e-commerce business in APAC, actually. In Hong Kong, in Taipei, we run large e-commerce business under the Yahoo brand name. And you're right that the appetite for new fraud solutions is high right now, right? We've been working hard to protect each transaction, and we review transactions systematically, right? Online while they're happening, as well as offline before fulfillment, to make sure there is no fraud. But the better we are at protecting that fraud, the better real growth for the business will be, and the better we can diffuse some of these attacks in real time. So there's definitely more of an urgency felt now with many businesses that we talk to regularly. But but COVID-19 is no different than the next online crisis that shows up, right? This is a round one. There might be a round two. Who knows next year, right? So to me, rather than look at it as a point problem, I think we have to look at it as building strength and sustainability into the systems, right? None of these crises come announced, or you don't have heads up that hey, it started in the country A, B, or C, and it's going to follow through to other countries. So go protect. I think the principles that apply to identity and protecting commerce have to apply as a strong security practice every single day. So even if the attacks happen while we're asleep, we're protected, right? So we have to build this into the fabric of our systems versus look at these as point problems.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. And I think it's interesting to see from our perspective in the space too, from working with digital identity, and I know both of you have talked about this, but a lot of these problems aren't really new. And thankfully, we've had a lot of smart people, mostly you two, no more than me, working on these problems for some time and really come up with solutions that can help people in this time of need. And this should just be taken as another catalyst to start thinking about these questions more broadly. But with that, I know we're coming up on time here, so I wanted to leave it Lovlesh and Stacy, both some time for you to maybe put some final thoughts on this or anything else you'd like to leave the audience with.
Well, I'll let Lovlesh go last, so I'll just quickly say, I'll just quickly say I totally agree with Simeon. These problems have been around forever. They're just really coming to the forefront because we have such an extreme situation right now. Everyone working from home, all users remote, all employees remote. And so you're seeing these problems under a microscope now. And so eventually this crisis will end, but the problems will remain. And so it's really good to obviously address them, now rather than later. Now is a good time.
So I'll put a slightly different angle on it. This is the opportunity to learn, right? Like I talked about, learning about our users as well as our employees with regards to their normal behavior patterns. You're getting so much data right now on good versus bad IPs that it's like you will never find this gold mine again. Right? Everybody's sitting at their trusted locations, right? So if you want to know, where your users are and what their day can look like, or what their access can look like, not so much their day will change, but what they do and what they don't do online, this is the time to go learn. So in the next attack, your systems are ready to fight.
Well, thank you again, Stacy and Lovlesh, for that great optimistic perspective. Love the good vibes. Hopefully we can put more of those out into the ethos right now. And without any further ado, the Cam, turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Simeon, and a big virtual round of applause for our panelists as well. Another fantastic session. We are going to push you another poll now. Would love to get everyone's feedback on this session so we can catch how we can continue improving these forums as we move forward. And a quick shameless plug, we have a new digital forum coming your way the first Tuesday of every month. That's May 5th, June 2nd, and July 7th. As we move to our new bespoke digital forums platform, we will actually have simultaneously two programming tracks going simultaneously for each of those upcoming forums. So twice the webinars, twice the panels, and twice the networking opportunities for our participants. So really hope that you will join us for those as well. Keep it tuned here. Stay in this very same Zoom. We will be starting the next panel in just 5 minutes, focused on identity and access management. Just to reiterate for folks who joined us part of the way through, the Zoom will not be changing. It's all one contiguous session. So just stay tuned here. You won't hear anything for the next few minutes as we all take a bio break, and we will be right back at you at 2 o'clock sharp Eastern. To kick off that next panel discussion. For folks who may have missed the first two panels, please visit our website at www.oneworldidentity.com. Those panels will be on the site for you to download as soon as they are bundled up for delivery. So if you missed it, don't worry, you will have full access, or for your colleagues who maybe are stuck on a Zoom call of their own right now. So stay tuned. We will be right back at you in just 5 minutes with more great content.